Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to the Roosevelt House and the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. I'm Peter MEYER, the program director of the Institute, where I have the distinct pleasure not only of working on events such as the one tonight, but directing and contributing to our news briefs and the policy analysis that appear on our website, which I invite all of you to visit at niceidthinktank.org. We have future events we'll find out about on the website. We have on March 26th an event on Black and Latino initiatives in New York City. And on April 22nd, we're very honored to have Philip Bamberger, the constitutional scholar, to come and host an event on church and state. The Institute is New York City's first university-based policy analysis and research institute devoted solely to understanding the challenges of PK-20 education. Strictly non-aligned, we aim to make it the go-to location for policy debate, analysis, and research. We are doubly fortunate to be in this splendid building, some of you have taken a tour of the Roosevelt House. Great historical importance, the former residents of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and their last home before moving to the White House, and now a vibrant public policy institute in its own right. We're here tonight to discuss one of the least understood but most fascinating education reform initiatives of the last 20 years, the granting of tax credits for donations to public and private schools. To consider the arguments for tax credits in general and the need for a tax credit bill in New York in particular, we have on our panel tonight Mr. Tom Carroll and Dr. Ashley Berner. Tom is a former legislative budget guru in the New York State Senate who turned his legislative skills to education in the late 1990s, helping win the battle to enact the Empire State's first charter school law in 1998. He then helped found Albany's first charter school network, the Brighter Choice Charter Schools, which now number 9 schools and educate nearly 30% of the capital's K through 12 public school children. Since 2012, Tom has been president of the Foundation for Opportunity in Education, one of the leaders of the effort to bring education tax credit legislation to New York. Ashley Berner is the CUNY Institute for Education Policy's deputy director. She has taught at a Jewish preschool, an Episcopal secondary school, and an open university. And most recently, she co-directed the Institute for Advanced Studies in Cultures program on education at the University of Virginia. Dr. Berner has published articles and book chapters comparing the educational practices of democratic nations, and she regularly serves as a consultant on research projects that explore academic and citizenship outcomes in different school sectors. Moderating tonight's discussion is David Steiner, the Institute's founding director and dean of the Hunter School of Education. David is also the former Commissioner of Education of New York State, and in that capacity, played a leading role in securing the state's $700 million Race to the Top award, radically restructuring teacher preparation and accountability, and telling some painful truths about our state assessments. And I would also like to introduce tonight 2 new members of the CUNYed team, Kelly Siegel-Steckler and MEYER. Kelly is our program assistant who has worked for a variety of educational programs focusing on leadership and global citizenship, including the United Nations Foundation's Global Classrooms. She is co-founder and managing director at Foundations for Leadership, where she oversees programs and events. MEYER is our Equity Research Fellow and currently a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she studies social welfare and education policy. Her current research focuses on early childhood education, specifically the effects of parent involvement and Head Start interventions. Welcome, Kelly and Mai. Finally, a small bit of housekeeping. You will have found, we hope, 5x3 cards on your chairs that can be used to write questions for our panelists tonight. We ask you to wait till Dean Steiner makes an announcement about the questions, before writing, just in case your question is answered during the discussion. And please write legibly and pass the cards to the side aisles where they will be gathered. Thank you again for coming tonight, and without further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to David Steiner.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome, everybody. It's absolutely delightful to have you here and to see a large number of new faces. I hope this will be the first of many visits to the Institute. It's especially happy for me to see Tom again, this time in New York rather than in Albany, and to begin a discussion around an issue that, as Peter said, strikes many people, I think, as something they've not heard of before. A number of you in the audience are specialists and experts, but I have to confess that even as someone who was very involved in educational policy directly, it was not until Ashley mentioned the phrase a few months ago that I had ever come across it. And that may be by design or accident, and that's something we may want to return to, the degree to which these kinds of policies stay below the radar screen or not. Let me begin by asking Tom a very straightforward question. Why tax credits, and why tax credits in particular for educational purposes? Why not just have the state legislature grant the money?
Yeah, there are, I'll answer your last question first, which is there are various constitutional reasons with the money coming directly out of the state treasury, because we have, as several dozen states do, a Blaine amendment that prohibits direct aid to religious institutions, which has been modified by constitutional amendment in court cases for certain exemptions, as you know, for technology and public health and so forth. So the constitutional issues are different with the tax credit. But the bigger question is why a tax credit of aid of this sort whatsoever. And as Peter indicated, I spent a good part of the last 15 years working on charter schools. And over 90,000 seats now exist around the state because the law that was adopted in 1998. And for the most part, that's a good development. But if you look at the last dozen years, you've had roughly 130,000 private seats. You've had roughly 130,000 Catholic-only private seats close over the same time frame. So when we started, the idea of charter schools was you had literally, particularly in New York City, hundreds of thousands of kids in schools that probably nobody in this room would ever want to actually send their children to. Not that you couldn't find schools in New York City you'd want to send your kids to. I don't mean to say that. But there's certainly schools that, particular schools that nobody in their right mind would want to send their children to. So the idea was you had to, in a sense, some people in Harlem have used the phrase flood the zone, that you had to create more supply. So if you created enough good schools, then you wouldn't have to really worry about the bad schools because everybody would move into the good schools. The problem is over roughly the same time period, a lot of the good schools, particularly on the Catholic side, but it also affects other segments of the private school market, have closed, collapsed, whatever you want to say, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 seats per year on a statewide basis have been lost. So if the idea was to reduce the number of parents and kids that were forced into choices that we would never exercise for our own children, it's been a spectacular failure in the sense that we have even more people now have less options. So we think it's important to have more holistic choice that across the spectrum, that one, avoids the Catholic school closure crisis, if not reverse it, that stabilizes the rest of the private market, that fixes, that encourages charter schools, and lastly, that since 2008, when the stock market crashed, there's been largely flat funding of schools. Funding has gone up a little, but because of inflation, pension obligations, and so forth, the actual spending in the classroom has been very tight across the state. We could put aside the argument about how much New York spends versus others, but given what the cost structure was when this all started in 2008, it's very difficult. So we also wanted an option that drove more money into the classroom in intentional ways or sensible ways. So the idea was, given that this country has among the greatest philanthropic impulses of anywhere in the world, that this state in particular has a density of philanthropy, that if you could tinker with the tax incentives and increase the incentive to unlock a lot of that philanthropy and the tremendous wealth that we have in New York State, that rather than going to the taxpayers for a tax increase, you would go here and try to use the tax code to get more money on the table to solve all of these various problems.
Let me push back on 2 points, one constitutional and the other practical. I'll take the practical one first. Unlike in a number of other states that have done this, the Senate version of this bill has no means testing for scholarship families. So it could go to the children of very, very wealthy families who presumably could choose to go to expensive private schools anyway. So that seems slightly at odds with the idea of funneling funds to those who need it most. And even the Assembly version sets the limit at 250,000, which strikes many people, I suspect, as a rather high level. So if the idea is to funnel what would otherwise have been public dollars into the salvation, I don't think is too strong a word to use, for those who would otherwise have gone to the worst schools, why not do a means test that's more aggressive? And then on the constitutional side, certainly the minority in the Supreme Court decision in 2011, and by minority I mean 4 justices, led by Justice Kagan, argued to some people rather persuasively that there's really no difference between a state saying, you know, your monies are going to not actually come to us but go to a place we've allowed, and the state simply sending those monies. In other words, that to quote one opinion, a dollar is a dollar, both for the person who receives it and the government that pays it. Whether the dollar comes from a tax credit label or a direct expenditure label is irrelevant. And I'll use the example from the justice.
This is from the minority or majority
this is
opinion?
Minority opinion, but it's a useful point. Suppose a state desires to reward Jews. I picked that because I'm Jewish, so I can get away with this. But I'm quoting from the Supreme Court dissent. Suppose a state desires to reward Jews by, say, $500 a year for their religious devotion. Should the nature of taxpayers' concern vary if the state allows Jews to claim the aid on their tax returns in lieu of receiving an annual stipend from the state? So 2 questions then, one on the means test, the other, isn't this just, to quote nicely the state union, a voucher by other means?
Okay. First of all, you actually asked 3 questions.
I tend to do that.
And I know when you were commissioner, numeracy was something that you were very interested in advancing in the state. But the last question was, the question about, in your example, allowing Jews to claim aid on their state tax returns. If we pass a tax credit that said Jews could, do that, it would be unconstitutional. What we're talking about is a tax credit that allows, thousands of donors on behalf of thousands of parents to make highly individual and personal decisions, much in the way they do now when somebody gives money to Hunter College, they get a tax deduction. So we're saying instead of getting a regular tax deduction, you're going to get a tax credit. So the constitutional issues on the tax side, and this has been upheld by Supreme Court, not just in the Arizona tuition case, but also in the Mueller decision and others, has been very consistent that when it comes to the tax code, that it's not viewed as government money if the money's never hit the state treasury. Under the minority opinion, as some people, Scalia and others have pointed out, all of private wealth would be viewed as government money until, the government paymaster decided we could keep whatever we wanted. They deigned would keep. I don't accept that worldview to start with, but more importantly, from a legislative perspective, we're trying to design a system that is consistent with Supreme Court majority opinions, not Supreme Court minority opinions. If the minority becomes a majority and they no longer believe in precedent, then we'll have to design the program in a different way. In terms of the means test, the Senate bill does not have a means test, but one will be added. And the Assembly has added, the version you're talking about reflects a version that came out today. I did not think that $250,000, particularly in this city, is an outrageous amount of money. That if you're a cop and a nurse, or even 2 UFT teachers at the top end of the pay scale, you could easily be pulling down that kind of money. Cop in New York City after 5 years makes over $100,000, not counting any overtime pay. I've never met a cop that didn't have overtime pay. So this is the average rent in Manhattan, which includes all of Manhattan, not just 20 blocks of here, is over $3,000 a month. So it's an exotically expensive place to live. So if we were talking about Kansas, $250,000, $300,000 might seem a lot. I think in New York City metro area, I think a lot of people would think that that's middle class. A lot of states have decided to do only low-income programs. The assembly sponsor has indicated that within the overall means test, they're creating a separate category to drive most of the money into low-income scholarships on the private half of the bill. So that takes care of both issues. But I feel very strongly that if you want to keep a city vibrant, that it's important to keep the middle class within the city. And the key to keeping the middle class within the city, certainly anybody who has children, is making it affordable for them to access whatever educational option
This is for
they
the whole
think is
state.
appropriate.
It
It is
isn't just for New
for
York
the whole
City.
state,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay.
So, and you know, if you look at de Blasio, for example, who in a sense has decided in his, we're going to tax rich people for pre-K, that he decided the middle class ended at $500,000. So that would put me to the left of Mayor de Blasio on this issue.
A place you're comfortable being in, I suppose. Sure. Let me bring in the international perspective for a moment and give you a couple of moments to catch your breath. This whole debate would be regarded as rather bizarre in a number of our peer countries. Can you say why?
Well, sure. Yes, this conversation would seem bizarre in most democracies around the world because most democracies support a staggering amount of diversity in schools that parents can choose. So, for example, the Netherlands funds 36 different types of schools on equal footing. They all have to adhere to the same curriculum, but go to a Jewish school, Orthodox Jewish, Hindu school, Montessori school, Seventh-day Adventist school, funded by the state. This is true in Alberta, Canada. This is true in Belgium. This is true in the United Kingdom. It's actually the norm among most democratic nations. So yes, having a conversation about how to fund plural education would be a little unusual.
Am I
And
right?
Could I add
Yeah,
one point,
please.
just for people who may not be familiar? And Abe Blackman is in the audience. He used to be Secretary of the Senate Finance Committee and funneled some of this money, so he knows intimately what I'm about to say, which is, I didn't mean that in a pejorative way. But in New York State, if you look at almost every aspect of the economy, we have a mix of public and private institutions, nonprofit, and religious and non-religious institutions. And they receive state money. So there are, St. Francis College gets state money, Bundy Aid, and its students are able to get tapped through the tuition assistance program. Every hospital in the city, no matter what the religion, if you took all of the religion out of the healthcare system in New York City, there'd be a lot of stretchers lining all the streets in New York City. If you looked at all of these preschool programs and Head Start programs and drug and alcohol programs, all of which receive state funding, a lot of them, Salvation Army, a lot of religious institutions are involved in the programs. So, and we have it before kindergarten and we have it after 12th grade. So for reasons that I've never understood, international comparisons or not, people get all excited when the conversation is between kindergarten through 12th grade. Mm-hmm. I have a simple theory, which is that's who the teachers' unions represent within those grades, who's running around getting people exercised about it. But intellectually, I don't understand, frankly, the intellectual distinction between St. Francis College getting money or, St. Francis Academy, if there is such a thing, a high school or an elementary school. In this case, we're even further removed from that because we're just saying private donors should be able to give money like they do now, except they'll get a higher tax incentive than before.
So,
Right now, nobody objects to people getting tax deductions for it. You could make a donation directly to your church and get a tax deduction, and nobody thinks that's remotely controversial to put it directly into the church.
Well, let me just say to Tom's point, the cultural logic of having a more uniform state school system in this country predates the time in which most people went to college or even secondary school. It goes back to the 19th century, as many of you know, into the anti-immigration and anti-Catholic biases that existed in our political culture. And so there's a different logic at work, I suppose, there. But I do want to say I think it's a mistake to look at educational diversity as primarily about religious education. Again, when you look around the world, many of the more innovative countries in this regard are funding, sure, they're funding religious schools, but they're also funding elite independent schools. As one example, Sweden in 1992 essentially went to a per capita funding system in which money follows the child between public schools or two private schools. And in some municipalities in Sweden, 45% of the students attend non-state schools. Only 12% of those schools are religious.
so let me press on the international comparison for a moment. In most of those countries, England, where I'm most familiar, where I grew up, the public dollars, in those cases, of course, pounds, that went to religious schools, went to those schools under certain conditions. Those schools had, the students in those schools had to take public exams. Now, in some of the tax credit versions that have been put out in other states, it is a condition, in fact, that the private schools that those tax credit dollars go to must enroll their students in public exams. That is not an aspect of the New York legislation.
Correct.
Could you say a word about why not?
I think you would find, with the exception of you and John King, maybe Norman Atkins, there aren't a lot of people looking to expand the state testing program at the moment, or expand the Common Core and everything else.
That's not exactly an answer, is it?
No. I was just having a little fun
That's
for starters. There are a number of states that require that the individual students that receive a scholarship have to take a state exam, not that the entire private
Right.
school
Right.
in which they're located take the
That's right.
exam. And reasonable men and women can agree or disagree on that issue. I'm not sure why, since it's not required when people make a donation and get a tax deduction, that suddenly that standard changes if they get a tax credit. But I understand that there are people that may disagree on that. In this state, we have a long tradition of the state not regulating the standards, curriculum, or assessments within the private school system, religious or not. That's a value. Some people place a higher value on that than others. My own view is, as we're going to kind of the homogenization of education and the standardization of what all the public schools do, that I think there's a parental interest in keeping part of the school market to not be homogenized and to be fully diverse, and to allow a lot of different approaches, including a variety of assessment approaches at the same time.
As you say,
But
people can differ on this.
And that
I
issue
mean,
will
the-
certainly
the-
be debated.
The argument on the other side is clear, which is these are dollars that would have gone to the state treasury. They're not just private dollars that would have stayed with individuals. And therefore...
But that's true with tax deductions as well.
Right, but these are more generous. Obviously, the difference between a deduction and a credit is a much more generous subsidy of a choice. The state is making a decision that monies it would have spent on behalf of the public now can go to private schools, religious schools, that are under no limit as to what they can instruct or what standards their students can meet. That strikes some of us as a bizarre kind of negation of the public trust.
Yeah, I simply am not philosophically at the same place that you are.
All right. Let
Yeah.
me push on a further point that again differentiates the New York
And
legislation.
just as an aside,
Yes.
in the charter school context, when the Race to the Top came through, the the brighter choice schools renounced all the race for the top money and had some interesting conversations with John King
May I just add
about that, because we thought the whole idea of charter schools in that context was to allow diversity of approaches, and that agreeing to take the race for the top money actually homogenized charter schools. So you may not agree with it, but my position is consistent across sectors.
Yep.
I think philosophically, the notion that education is a public trust does support the idea of financial support and accountability being brought together. That's my opinion. I think most educational systems around the world follow that model. And to be very specific, most of these countries test on and require a curriculum that can be taught in many different ways. They may regulate the academic outcomes, but they by and large don't intrude into the ethos of a school, which is the important point, I think.
But state tests, having gone through charter schools for a lot of years, there's nothing, and I've been on both sides of this particular issue. When people complain about kind of the evils of state testing, like fellow parents and stuff, I go, like, have you actually looked at the test? There's really nothing on the test that you would be offended that your child knows. Certainly on the ELA or math tests, we could argue about global studies and some other tests at the high school level, but certainly on those tests. But it certainly does change, and it did in a charter school context, as the standards kept changing every year at the state level, and the testing regime kept changing. We had to change the timing in which we taught particular subjects, because the timing in which the test was given, those topics. So we had to reverse engineer everything we were doing within the school to align with the test schedule and the sequence of which subjects were taught.
As did every other public school.
Correct. But but you shouldn't pretend there's a loss of autonomy at the school level when that occurs. It's not a neutral
No.
factor.
I don't think anyone
So
would argue that.
let's talk about another difference, and one that perhaps hasn't been much discussed. Most of the other states try to ensure that when I use my tax credit, I can't use it on behalf of my own child at the school. Talk to me about what's in place in New York to avoid that.
Okay, it's flat out prohibited by the language of the bill. So it's simply not allowed. It would constitute tax fraud.
So
So you could go to the pokey or whatever penalty. I don't know what.
So
the tax
just because
people
not
do, but-
everybody may be familiar with how this actually works.
Yeah,
So-
I should explain, because some states have tax credits or tax breaks for the parent to take for their own child. I personally am not opposed to that, but that's not what this proposal is. This is a proposal to incent individuals and businesses to give money in a more broad-minded way that doesn't benefit their children whatsoever. And so it would be illegal under the bill for somebody to give money to their individual school and tag it for their kid, or to get an offset against their tuition, because, wink and a nod, there was a donation made. And Georgia is probably the two states where they've had the biggest problems are Georgia and Arizona, which we refer to the Wild West of the charter school movement, but also the Wild West of tax credits as well, in which you have somewhat of an ultra-libertarian state, but they've had abuses because the way the laws were written in a very loose way. And Georgia, out of embarrassment, because the scandals there, has what used to be allowed in Georgia is not even allowed in Georgia now. So even south of the Mason-Dixon line, they cleaned up their act. But we were very mindful of the abuses that happened in other states.
Okay. Let me broaden the conversation, bring both of you in. Is the union entirely unfair in claiming that this is a voucher by other means? In other words, what this does is it says, what the state is saying essentially is, we will do without $300 million, to use one of the figures that's being bandied around. We'll just do without $300 million of public tax income, which we would spend on behalf of the whole population. And instead, we're going to make sure that that 300 million, at least 50% of it, 50% of the 300 million goes to private schools, most of which will be religious. How is that, all legal niceties aside, and we can argue about whether the Supreme Court is, sitting on precedent in the minority or the majority till the cows come home, but leaving the legal
Well,
niceties
there's actually
aside,
no argument which was the majority opinion.
no, but whether it was sitting on precedent or not
Right,
is an
yeah.
argument. Why is the union wrong, prima facie?
Because words have meaning,
Yes.
okay? And a voucher, simply put, is a check from the government, from the state treasury. So the Supreme Court had other cases in which they've upheld voucher systems
Right.
on federal grounds, which doesn't mean they could survive a state challenge on the Blaine Amendment grounds. So in the Cleveland case, the Zellman case, the Supreme Court upheld a voucher plan on the theory that government was not choosing the schools, wasn't saying Jews can give to Jewish schools or Catholics can give to Catholic schools. They're saying we're awarding scholarships. You can redeem them at public or private schools. Public schools in the case of out-of-district tuition to a public school that you don't pay taxes in that district, but you're sending your kids across district line. And they said even if all of the money in the end went to religious schools, this is roughly what they said, as long as it was the result of countless individual decisions by parents and not government officials, there was no issue. So, but at any rate, that's what a voucher is. A voucher happens to be constitutional under the U.S. Supreme Court. But what this is a tax credit. A tax credit, whether I get a tax credit for buying an electric car or for opening a brewery or locating the Tonight Show in, New York City, I'll get a, state tax credit now. And the governor's proposing roughly $2 billion in tax relief, tax credits, tax preferences, whatever you want to call them. And what we're saying is, if you're going to be doing that for a state tax reduction, you're going to be doing it for manufacturing companies, you're going to be doing it for property tax relief, why shouldn't some of that money at the tax table, as the negotiators would call it, be used for education?
Let me press you, though. This isn't about anything. This is about money, large portion of which will go to religious schools. That's why the Establishment Clause was discussed by the Supreme Court in the Arizona case.
But in this case, half the money is
Right.
going to
Yes.
public schools right off the
Understood.
bat.
Understood.
And a portion of the other half
Yes.
will likely end up in the coffers
Sure, but call
of
it
private schools. So a majority is going to public schools, to be
call it
precise.
100 million. It doesn't matter.
Right.
In the end, for the person who receives it and the government that pays it, whether the dollar comes from a tax credit or direct expenditure, it comes to the same thing. It's still money that would otherwise have been in the public treasury.
A little context. We've argued unsuccessfully to the state teachers union and the city teachers union on this point. State teachers union is a little more rabid on this issue than the UFT is. If the money goes into this general budget negotiations,
Yep.
they will get 15 cents on the dollar.
That's right.
That's been true for roughly as long as I can remember. If the money goes into this program, they will get 50 cents on the dollar.
Public schools, yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, if you believe in numeracy, and that extends to union headquarters, 50 cents is more than 15 cents. So as a practical matter, aside from the legal issues, I'm not sure why they wouldn't take the 50 cents instead of the 15 cents. So what's really underlying here is, first of all, and they have no objection to taking the one half of the bill, right? So what it really is about, they don't want the money going to parents to choose another option.
Religious schools.
Now, I understand that may be their job or their conception of their job, but that doesn't mean that's the public interest or the parents' interest to have their options hemmed in that way, because that's the political special interest view of one group. And the fact that we have 2/3 of the people in the assembly in favor of it, we have an overwhelming share of the Democrats in the assembly, which was not the case, as Abe knows, when charter schools went through, that we got 55-4 vote in the state Senate, means that the arguments that they're making on this is a proto-voucher, backdoor voucher, blah, 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 it's just people aren't buying what they're selling. It's linguistically not true, and people don't understand why, given roughly $60 billion goes to public education in New York from all sources, why the world as we know it is going to come to an end if $150 million goes to private schools. when we already give state money to private schools directly through textbook aid, nurse aid, computer aid, all this kind of stuff, which you used to
Well,
administer.
may I also say that with the Supreme Court, the issues that you're talking about, David, really turn on what constitutes endorsement and establishment of a church. And the Supreme Court's decisions have changed over the last 75 years. You see, with the Lemon case in 1971, the Supreme Court was mindful of governments not engaging in, quote, excessive entanglement with religious institutions. Subsequently, there have been decisions that have had a more nuanced view of what constitutes endorsement. And the most recent decisions have indicated that a neutral view towards religion and secular and religious institutions is more appropriate. So there's actually more room in the jurisprudence than a sort of strict line of separation would suggest.
The interesting thing about Zellman, this is the Supreme Court case on vouchers, they set up a 5-point test. And it strikes me as slightly ironic that one of those 5 points is that the aid must go to parents and not to schools. Whereas with the tax credit, what we're really saying is the aid can come from a parent, but it can't be for the parent.
No, it would be similar in that respect, that the scholarship would go to the parent. Obviously, the scholarship's being redeemed as under the tuition assistance program,
Right.
is being
But not
received by an
person who's getting the
educational
credit.
institution. They don't get to pocket it and
Right, they
go
don't
to
get the
Paris on the
credit.
money.
I think
But
that,
yes.
in the end, I think we can just see the different opinions. The one view that
But we could have struck, for example, on the public half of the bill,
Right.
you can get a tax credit. This is the education investment tax credit. You can get a tax credit for making a direct donation to a
Right.
public school.
not
The bill purposely does not allow somebody to get a tax credit for a direct donation
to a private
school.
Understood. But the philosophical difference, I think, let me see if I can characterize it just for our audience. The majority in the Supreme Court found a meaningful difference. Thus, they didn't, as you know, allow standing to the plaintiffs. They found a meaningful difference between a tax credit. The money never actually comes to the Treasury, but is used for a purpose that the state has designated, and the money passing the threshold into the state and then being used for a purpose that the state designates.
Right.
Right now, the minority found that to be a vacuous distinction. I just want to, I mean, that's...
Right. But even if you don't accept, the reason the question of standing came up is there can't be an establishment. The gist of this issue, there can't be an establishment clause issue, because the government's not establishing anything, because under a tax credit, it's private donors giving money to a private institution. And so there's no public aspect. So if you take your 5-part test, but the same Supreme Court, well, different membership, but the Supreme Court in Zellman upheld a voucher program anyway. So even if it was a voucher program, which we're not saying it is, there's no federal constitutional issue. You'd have a Blaine Amendment issue. But even the 5-part test they talk about here, valid secular purpose, education, must go to parents, it does. Broad class of beneficiaries, it does. Must be neutral respect to religion, it is. We don't care where you redeem the money, half of it's going to public schools. On the private, there's no preference for choosing a religious and non-religious, and there must be adequate non-religious options, which there are. We have a robust non-religious independent school sector in New York and have for several hundred years. So even if we had to meet the voucher test,
right.
and I'm not conceding it is a voucher because it's not, we're actually better positioned as the way the law is structured than the Cleveland voucher program was.
We've mentioned the Blaine Amendments a few times. Perhaps we should explain what a state Blaine Amendment is. So in the late 19th century, there was a very strong nativist movement that was very anti-Catholic in particular, became anti-Jewish, was very anti-immigrant. And it was protective of the dominant Protestant majority. And this played out in education by calling for, quote, secular schools or the common school that were ostensibly non-sectarian but were in effect Protestant. And this sort of reached the high mark in the 1870s when a senator from Maine, Senator Blaine, tried to amend the federal constitution to prohibit funding going to any religious institutions. It was defeated in Congress, but many states, in fact, I think 36 states, have some version of a Blaine amendment. Some of them forbid direct aid to religious institutions. New York's forbids direct and indirect aid. So,
Yeah, let me close that portion by saying that with the Blaine Amendment in place in New York, it is not entirely clear what would happen in the New York courts. And I say that, assuming that the tax credit goes through. I say that because New Hampshire right now is looking at a tax credit. The lower courts have actually found against it on the basis of New Hampshire's constitution. It is expected to go to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and we just don't know. The governor has come out against the tax credit in New Hampshire on constitutional grounds, at least publicly on constitutional grounds. So while you're absolutely right that legally speaking, this is not being looked at the same way a voucher would be looked at, and one can't necessarily deduce one from the other.
Sure.
There's nothing given about the legal status in New York of the tax credit.
I can tell you from, people having conversations with hundreds of legislators, not a single legislature has raised the Blaine Amendment or church-state issues.
Right, but they're not
So
making
it's
law
just
in
not.
the same way.
And a lot of them directly give what are called member items or earmarks directly to religious institutions. A lot of them, particularly on the Democratic side, in a lot of the districts, the religious institutions are among the last, vibrant organizations within their communities. And they don't view it the same way it's viewed on, outside of maybe the Upper West Side and certain parts of Westchester. It's just not, seriously, it's just not, it does not come up. I thought it was going to be the central issue when this all got started, and it just has been a big, dud of an issue. It has no resonance in the legislature whatsoever.
But it's not the legislature who will
No,
decide the
but in terms of
constitutionality of the
the
issue.
first is we're not even going to get to have a nice judicial battle unless it gets adopted in the first instance. So that hasn't been a big issue. The financial issues, whether the financial plan has to come together, whether it's going to be $300 million or another amount, or whether they even do it. They've got every legislator has a lot of competing interests that they balance every year. So I can't predict how it's going to come out. But I can predict if it does not happen, it's not going to be because of church-state issues. That would be the last reason it's defeated.
Let's go one last time to the international story here. As we look at systems that allow for a much greater variety of funding of schools from the public dollar, whether they restrict that to schools that demand public assessments or not, is there any research that would suggest that this is a good idea, a neutral idea, a poor idea, to diversify the recipients of public dollars for a greater variety of schools?
sure, good question. Yes, there's actually an abundance of data from overseas and also in this country that suggests that schools that, well, several things. First, individual schools that have a distinctive mission, a mission that goes all the way down, not merely into a single class, but or course, but into the way teachers are trained, the discipline of the school, the atmosphere of the school, the public rituals of the school, and so forth. Schools with that kind of distinctive mission have better outcomes academically in terms of citizenship and in terms of character. I don't think that's disputable in terms of the research. This is also true of charter schools that take a very distinctive mission. There's a wonderful book by Scott Sider called Character Compass that looks at 3 Boston charter schools that have very, very distinctive missions. So I think this is, the research, let me just take Sweden as an example. Sweden found, because of the way they structured their per pupil funding, to give some more detail, they wouldn't allow the private schools to select students on the basis of academic ability, which was is a proxy for middle class background. So in contrast to Chile, which did not put those restrictions and in which the middle classes overused the school choice programs. Sweden wouldn't allow that. So in the most serious studies of Sweden and their reforms suggest that not only the students who go to the private schools, but the students who remain in the state schools do better academically, particularly where there's a really rich educational ecology within a given municipality. So long-winded answer to your question, yes, there is quite a bit of data.
I'm going to encourage folks who would like to start writing their questions on cards to start doing so now. A little bit of history while you do so. In New York in 1805, there were schools run by Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, Quakers, Dutch Reform groups, and free school societies. All of those schools were funded by public dollars. One of the interesting facts that I was surprised to learn was that until 1864, private schools were being funded by public money in Washington, D.C., as late as 1864. So one could make the argument, I'm not making it, but one could make the argument that we are cyclically returning to a situation in which a greater portion of what could have been public dollars, to use I hope a neutral phrase.
Also called private wealth.
Also called private wealth. What could have been public dollars are being encouraged to return from the public purse to private schools. And I think the question that the union is raising and that others are raising is $300 million a year may not sound very much out of 60-odd billion, but then it's 600 million, then it's $1 billion, and then we're in Sweden.
Could I just make one minor point? If I'd spent the last 2 years working on a solar tax credit for exactly the same amount of money, none of these arguments would be made.
That's right.
Right, because
it's not about religious schools.
Right. So the issue is not really about $300 million or $150 million.
let me say something also
hasn't.
about teacher unions in the other countries. Most of the countries that have plural educational systems do have teachers unions. And I know of very little conflict that actually happens over these issues. And I think the reason is because having plural educational systems fits well with teachers as well. They can, in many cases, go to a school, be it Montessori or Catholic or Orthodox Jewish, that matches their own views about life and the child. And so it sits well with teachers when it's part of the cultural context.
And I should point out, and this is a distinction, you know, the unions are opposed to this, but frankly their vehemence against charters is much more intense than on this issue. And one of the reasons for that is, in this area, the archdiocese schools are all unionized. They're not represented by the United Federation of Teachers. With charters, there always was the sense from the, this is in my perspective, but the union perspective, that it was secretly a plot to de-unionize public education because people were moving from a unionized setting to a non-unionized setting. We could argue whether that's good or bad for kids, but that was their belief. Here, there isn't that dimension, that political dimension to it. A lot of the UFT's own members are in Catholic schools in New York City, for example. Mm-hmm. So some of them, and one of the reasons we have 15 or 16 major labor unions in favor of the legislation is because the kids of cops and firefighters and court officers and construction workers and so forth send their own kids to private schools, be they Catholic or not.
My last question. Should it worry us, should it worry the public in New York State, that dollars that would otherwise have been administered by the state could go to support an extremist private school that is not subject to public exams, that is not subject to any constraint on its curriculum, that could teach just about anything it wants, and that they have given up access to that public dollar to fund that school?
Now, I don't know whether you trust this group of people that the bill entrusts to oversee such issues, but in the bill, the ability to authorize a scholarship organization or deauthorize it rests with the State Board of Regents. So whether that gives you great comfort or nightmares, You're,
It sounded so good until that one.
you were better situated than I am on whether that was a good resolution of that and many other potential issues.
We invite questions from the audience, and Peter, will you? Thank you. Good.
You said sorted or sorted?
How does this tax credit bill and the laws behind it ensure that all private schools will get their fair share?
Well, there's absolutely nothing in the bill that would ensure that all schools get their fair share, nor would I actually favor that, because the focus on the bill is empowering parents to be able to choose wherever they decide themselves is the best place for their child at a particular point in time. And so that will benefit some schools and will not benefit other schools based on thousands of individual decisions. So I know my own case. I have two kids. We were talking before, their personalities are as far apart as you possibly could imagine. I know my two brothers and I have completely different personalities, learning styles, so forth. And so I know one person, a friend of mine, who sent has a large family, a number of kids to public schools, a number of kids to Catholic schools, some to non-religious private schools, and his wife homeschooled two others because they made decisions based on each kid in terms of what was best. So setting in the legislation what the answer is for all of the children in the state, the whole theory of the bill is that government shouldn't be making those decisions.
Question here, what's the prognosis for this becoming a law this year?
I am cautiously optimistic, but Albany is a very difficult place to predict. We have the general, I'll try not to overstate anything because people change positions all the time. The Senate has passed a version of this bill twice by overwhelming margins. So all three of the legislative leaders on the Senate side are in favor of it, not just because they voted for it, but two of the leaders spoke at a rally in Westchester that had 5,000 people at. The other one has spoken before a number of groups. In the Assembly, the Speaker has not stated a position one way or the other. The Speaker is opposed to vouchers, but previously, in earlier discussions of this kind of issue, has said he does not view tax credits the same as he views vouchers. I would not predict where the Speaker's going to come out, but roughly 3/4 of his conference is in favor of the bill, including the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and some very senior members, virtually all of the Black and Hispanic caucus in the legislature. And we have a very diverse set of community groups to where New York City and elsewhere in favor.
This actually picks up on a point we were discussing earlier about whether the state should insist on the testing of children who get the get the tuition credits. Should we worry, this is kind of a question on the other side of that worry, should we worry about state intrusion into private schools if we move towards these kinds of tax credits?
The bill right now includes a provision that prohibits additional regulations on private schools. Because within the private school space, the fear is for $150 million, which is a lot of money, but there are individual private schools that have raised more than $150 million. So for a relatively modest amount of money by New York standards, the state budget's roughly, $150 billion now, that they would sacrifice on the altar of the tax credits, their autonomy would be something that they would not be in favor of doing.
And I'm not sure that that we need to worry over much about private schools being policed by the state. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that when you look around the world at the international scenario. The governments tend to set standards and accountability requirements, but again, not to intrude upon the heart of the matter of the schools. There are some exceptions, of course. But.
Right. You have to have a substantially equivalent education. Even if you're homeschooling, you have to do that. And there's some oversight, but there's a great broad band of freedom right now.
Fairly straightforward question, but I think pertinent. The purpose of tax credit rather than deduction is still not clear to this questioner. Why not just donate directly to scholarship funds and take a deduction?
You can, and lots of people do, and large number of students through, just in the city, Children's Scholarship Fund, the UJA Federation, Intercity Scholarship Fund, Patrons Program, Student Sponsor Partnership. Just a few I know that are within the space of the Archdiocese. Futures in Education in Brooklyn and Queens. There's another program out on Long Island. There's lots of scholarship funds that already raise a bunch of money. The reason that anytime you go from a deduction to a credit is because you're trying to increase the incentive and increase the amount of money that goes for the purpose. The secular purpose in this case is making sure parents are able to get an appropriate education for their kids.
So it's essentially fair to say that it's the government's way of saying this is a social good and we want to encourage it. Is that fair to
Right,
say?
and at the end of the day, even if they make the judgment to do this, it's actually, I'm not suggesting our bills even handle like half goes public, half goes private. But if you look at the total state budget, it's certainly not an even disbursement of money between public and private schools. The overwhelming share of the bet that the government's making, and frankly with the level of success, particularly with more honest state tests over time, has not been spectacularly impressive. We talked earlier about the middle class, what the level of the income be. One of the interesting about the state test, and one of the virtues of the state test, is it's made clear that the failure isn't really just, it used to be that everybody thought the only people who were being failed, I don't mean to say only, that came out wrong, but the only people being failed are low-income children. And then, as we talked about, then the first re-benchmarking, working class families realized that they were being misserved. And now you're starting to see why you're getting this counter reaction is because middle class moms and dads are finding out that their kids, little Johnny isn't as smart as they thought he was. And frankly, they would prefer being lied to and told their kid was prepared than have to deal with the uncomfortable truth that their child is not prepared. So the fact that we've now revealed for all the world to see that every income spectrum across the state, including in Scarsdale, is not doing as well as they need to be for kids to be college ready, then our answer has to be commensurate with that knowledge, which is we're not dealing strictly with a low-income problem. I think the low-income problem is the most intense. It's the end. I think the bill will put most of the scholarship money in there, but I don't think it's the only serious problem we're facing in the state.
Question on pre-K. Can the tax credit be used for pre-K? If not, why not?
Pre-K through 12th grade.
So it can.
Yes.
I think, hold on, just trying to read this. There's a question here about whether wealthy parents couldn't, 1 minute after midnight when they can use these tax credits, flood organizations that simply fund very affluent private schools.
Okay, there's a couple, it's a fair question. The bill is not designed for the Dalton, Spence, collegiates of the world. And so, first of all, the scholarship organization that's a recipient has to serve multiple schools. Most of those schools have single school scholarship funds, much like a university or college in the United States would have. And the funding is mostly, the charitable giving, mostly is alumni-driven and parent-driven. It's a different kind of philanthropy. People are going to give intensely because they're benefiting directly from it, or generations have
And
benefited.
the tax credits can't support those foundations.
Right.
You're saying.
Right. So I'm not saying that a individual parent who goes to a broader scholarship fund couldn't choose to send their kid there, but just because the cost of those schools at $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, chances are this is not going to be decisive in whether they could attend those schools or not. So that's the biggest reason.
I think there was a question actually upstairs.
I mean, I had a legislator tell me he wanted to make sure, I won't name the school, that a particular high-end independent school could not get scholarship money. And I said, I understand why you don't want rich people going to that school getting money. But if you had a poor person, this was a district in the Bronx, if you had a poor person in your district who had a chance to get the quality of the education that they could get at that school, if they got a scholarship, why would that not be in the public interest to make that possible? Because what he was proposing was to keep exclusive schools even more exclusive.
If you could repeal the Blaine Amendment and support vouchers, last question. Would you do so?
I think it's, for me, I'm focused just on doing the tax credit. The Blaine Amendment, I think, should be repealed or overturned because because of the anti-Catholic origins of the Blaine Amendment. I would be in favor of its repeal because I think it was an illegitimate amendment from the start. So I would be in favor of its repeal. Even if it was repealed, I would do it as a tax credit.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
You to the audience. Appreciate it.
Thank you.